So the developers, after about 2 years of a gagging order, have allowed me to talk about this because it was publicly leaked by a former tester. So technically speaking, this is public news. Now, this was leaked in the special chat, which I do believe some people do have access to that are non-staff members. So technically it is a public leak, and I have clarified with Dog Days for this, so I can talk about it. Anyways, this revolves around 2 toys. This being the Abyss/Corruption toy in the Cyber City Roblox multipack and the Riot, this enemy here. Now, it may not surprise you to know that these enemies are not in the Tower Defense Simulator, at least not in their current form. And also, the medic here isn't in Tower Defense Simulator. Actually, this is the reworked medic. I already talked about it, but yes, this is what the reworked medic was meant to look like. But this was meant to be an enemy in the game, the Corruption as it's called here. Now, the Corruption is slightly based on the Awakened Fallen King model that was leaked back in 2020 actually. I can't talk about that apart from this video, but I can only acknowledge the fact that the Corruption here looks a bit like the Awakened Fallen King. However, this enemy would obviously not see the light of day. Why is that? Well, it was planned to be in the game. However, the thing about this enemy was that it was meant to be the final boss enemy intended for 2021 PvP mode. Now, it may surprise you to know that PvP mode has been in development since 2021. I mean, we have seen some leaks about it, including a Roblox Spotlight trailer. Actually, the Roblox 2021 cinematic video, where it actually leaks some things that we've never seen in the game, including the map where it is involved in. In fact, for whatever reason, Tower Defense Simulator's part is the most highlighted part here on this track. I don't know why. Maybe Tower Defense Simulator... Actually, to be fair, Tower Defense Simulator is like one of the top 30 games in Tower Defense in Roblox history. But the fact that this many people care about an unreleased map in Tower Defense Simulator is quite staggering anyways. But this is a PvP map. As you can see, there are blue barrels here and red barrels here. This is the unreleased sand map, officially called Dusty Ruins. Now, I'll talk about the maps later on. However, for the purposes of this video, you can see that the Corruption enemy isn't shown here. So how do we know this? Well, obviously, it's because a tester has actually told us. Now here, this person responds to someone calling it the Abyss. It's called the Corruption, but I believe in the game it's called the Abyss, but in the Roblox toy pack it's called Corruption. It's weird. The Roblox toy pack has renamed some of the enemies, including the Neko DJ, which is called Starcat DJ Singer or something like that. So the community most knows it as the Corruption enemy, but internally I believe its name is actually called the Abyss. But here it was confirmed to be the final boss of PvP mode. So it's interesting that 2021 PvP mode back in the day would have had an ending. However, that being said, the recent PvP test that we've had does technically have an ending. It ends on wave 31. It's just that it repeats the last wave over and over again. While wave 31 is the last wave that you'll ever encounter because it'll just loop itself over and over again, technically an infinite wave, this does technically make the Fallen King that appears, or well, any other boss, the Fallen King if you're a high-ranked PvP player, the last boss to appear in PvP mode, which I think is the most likely outcome for the Corruption enemy. I think the developers would have likely looped the last wave over and over again with the Corruption enemy, or the Abyss boss, and repeated it spawning in multiple times, similar to how we saw the Fallen King spawn in multiple times for the current, or the recent, PvP mode testing. However, that being said, PvP mode back in the day did allow you to triumph the game. The fun fact about PvP mode is that you could actually triumph it if your opponents also were good enough and you made like a common pact not to kill each other. However, this rarely occurred given the fact that, well, the purpose of PvP mode was to destroy the other enemy. And so that's what happened. Most people spawned in a load of enemies that the other person couldn't deal with, or the other person just had too weak of a tower to actually deal with the amount of enemies that were spawned in. However, I do believe that no matter what the base health was, if you both reached the end of the game, it was random whoever won. It's not actually based on the amount of base health that the other person had. This is a change from the recent PvP testing. It's whoever has the most base health, and if you're equal, then it's random. So while the Abyss enemy was considered to be the final enemy, and we kind of know of some other enemies, so it would have been its own unique wave structure, as opposed to have copied Fallen mode, or any of the other game modes, which was previously used for PvP testing, where you could just choose any game mode. I don't think the Corruption enemy would have been the true final enemy. It would just repeat itself over and over again. I mean, technically, it is the final enemy, since you're most likely to lose the Abyss, given the fact that it is a final boss. But on a technicality, it is not the final boss. It is probably the last naturally spawning enemy that you'll encounter, though. And yes, again, this is said from Mentin, who discovered this. He is not a tester. He messaged me to see if we could talk about this on the wiki. I messaged Dog Days. He said because it's public, yes, we can. Now, interestingly enough, this Abyss enemy, you may notice, actually has an eye. This was despite the fact that all enemies at the time had no face, or was on the approach of having no face. As you can see here, the Soul Sealer has no face. The crown was similar to, I believe, the Wakened Fallen King at the time. However, this whole mesh here, kind of similar to the Fallen King. Well, ignoring the fact that the Awakened Fallen King is obviously similar to the Fallen King. However, the sword itself here that appears is kind of similar to the Void Reaver's broadsword. This is not to say that the final version seen in the Cyber City Roblox pack was going to be the final enemy, or the final Abyss enemy that was seen in PvP mode. After all, there are some changes from what was seen in the Roblox toy compared to what was seen in the game. For example, the Speedy King, that had a sad face, and I don't believe the Speedy King has ever had a sad face. Furthermore, I do believe that the Speedy King officially holds a gun, which obviously does not do here. Meanwhile, you can very much see the broadsword inspiration for the Abyss enemy. This isn't to say that the Abyss enemy would have a broadsword, it's just that this is what Roblox saw, probably likely saw the Void Reaver model and said, yes, that's a very good looking sword, we'll use that for the Corruption enemy. If you ask me, it looks slightly out of place. I don't think it suits the Corruption enemy all that much, so I don't think that this would have been the final version seen in the game. This has come from someone, by the way, who has not actually seen the Abyss or the Corruption enemy for a really long time. I might as well have never seen it. I do believe I have seen it, but it's been such a while that it's been removed from my memory, and I don't know what it actually looks like. Obviously, based on this, it looks like a black and white enemy, but things could have changed up. As for the second enemy, called the Riot, there's been a misconception that the Riot enemy has been recently added to the game, or added to the game since July 2022, which is when this toy was released. That is not the case. I do believe there are some similar enemies that have been added since then, so a notable enemy which kind of looks like this is the Rusher. As you can see here, looking at this and looking at this, you can see that they're kind of very similar. Now, I'm not entirely sure if the Rusher enemy reused some parts of the Riot enemy. I don't know if actually the Riot enemy was the official name for the enemy in Tower Defense Simulator. This is similar to how the Corruption enemy is not the official name for the version in Tower Defense Simulator. It's actually called Abyss. However, yeah, again, it's very, very similar. You can see the arm pads here. You can see the arm pads here. The Riot shield kind of looks similar to this Riot shield. It's got a hole here and a hole here. The difference is that it looks like it's got a bit bitten off here, whereas this one doesn't. But I mean, the armor looks similar. The helmet kind of looks similar, except this one's more mangled up. And obviously, this is green, whereas this is red. So you can see why people thought that the Riot Guard, this also being called an R enemy, the Rusher, don't sting in the comments, I know what you're thinking when I said that. You can easily see why many people thought that the Riot enemy was recently added to the game as the Rusher enemy. Because after all, the Rusher enemy was released in July 2022, whereas this was also released in July 2022. However, that is not actually the case. So here, the Riot is not actually a PvP enemy, unlike the Corruption and the Abyss enemy. So this image here, it's in Polish, because Mentin is Polish, but it links to the Riot enemy. So here, the former tester says that this wasn't a PvP enemy actually, it was going to replace the tank. Now bear in mind, the tank looks like this. It was just a fast-ish enemy which had no abilities, despite the fact when the commander says that the tank was coming, it's got a throwing arm. Now I can't lie, in Fallen mode, this was kind of a lame enemy. It spawned in on wave 30 and not many people paid much attention to it. It couldn't even spawn in from the mystery boss. So actually, having the Riot replace the tank, probably a smart move. However, I assume that would have come with a rework of Fallen mode, or Legacy Fallen mode, as it was called at the time. Because all of these enemies, yeah, they were slightly outdated. Like the Summoner boss, that was added in like 2020. Templar would eventually be replaced by the Warden. The Fallen King would get a remodel, and as you can see, its attire is similar to the Corruption enemy, just to point that out. And yes, soon after this was released, Enemies Beta was released that changed the appearance of all of these enemies. So I guess the tank would have been directly replaced instead of getting an Enemies Beta appearance. Because actually, fun fact, it did have an Enemies Beta appearance. So, for example, some enemies didn't have an Enemies Beta appearance, like the Glitch. However, this is not to say that eventually the tank would have been replaced. For example, the Mystery does have an Enemies Beta appearance, but you never actually see it in Tower Defense Simulator anymore because it was replaced by the Breakers. The Breakers obviously being an enemy where it replaced another enemy before the Fallen mode rework. Now here, we actually got an insight of the ability of the Riot enemy, where it would act like the Lunar Shield, as opposed to, say, the Fallen Rusher, where it would randomly charge forwards. In case of the Fallen Rusher, it charges forward whenever it spawns in because of its shield. When you break its shield, it no longer spawns in like it's Sonic or something. However, in a shield, as I should call it, it actually spawned in without its shield, I believe, but then randomly it could use its shield to have high defense and gain a much faster speed. So from this conversation, it looks like the Riots would have had a similar ability to this. They also mention one Necromancer enemy. However, because we weren't leaked this and I don't have any model for it, I don't know what they could be talking about here. Because actually, fun fact, I've actually never seen the Riot. Officially, at least. Not entirely sure if I should blow my cover here. But officially, at least, I've never seen what the Riot is in the game. Now, why it's fairly obvious why the Corruption/Abyss enemy was cancelled is because PvP mode wasn't released. It's kinda unsure why the Riot was cancelled, given the fact that it was meant to be a for Fallen mode replacement. I guess it's likely because the developers thought it wasn't worth the effort of replacing Fallen mode, and this was in 2022. Yeah, there were updates, but there weren't any weekly updates. And replacing enemy back in the day would have been a kind of a big deal. In fact, adding a new enemy, even just one new enemy to a game mode would have been a big deal. So for example, when the Templar was added, the developers did make a big fuss about it. Even featured on its own game mode icon, which is kind of funny nowadays because the Templar, I feel like, has been forgotten about. Is it sad that we didn't see the Riot in the game? I'm not entirely sure. To be fair, I think it would have been a good replacement for the tank, because the tank enemy, it kind of is bad, and the model itself, even when it was released, I thought it was eh. I mean, nothing does compare to the second version of the tank, which looked like this, and could actually throw rocks, and had an ability. Now, obviously, it being 2025, it likely means that the Corruption/Abyss enemy and the Riot enemies are likely not going to be added to Tower Defense Simulator. I mean, after all, it weren't even officially announced by the developers. It's just that Roblox used it for their toy models used by Jazzwares. The reason for this is because Roblox, I assume, has like a preview of like the updates that Tower Defense Simulator was going to. After all, they have the cinematic trailer, so it seems like whatever the developers submitted for Roblox, including PvP mode in its entirety, Roblox had the freedom to use any one of TDS's assets, so decided to use some unreleased assets, namely the Corruption/Abyss enemy and the Riot enemy. I mean, also, they used the reworked medic in the Cyber City pack, which I didn't notice until now, actually. But not much can be said. But it's interesting that Roblox themselves would actually post a kind of a Geneva Convention idea. I mean, actually, it's a red cross, but not on a white background, so I think Roblox kind of gets away with it. But it's almost a Geneva Convention. Roblox, I'm watching you, actually, to be fair. I think you've cancelled this entire toy line.